Hello and welcome back. This is the last section in our discussion of light. We're actually going to knock out these last two parts in the same bit because they're very much related to each other. So we're going to first talk about spectral lines and where those come from, and then we'll talk a bit about the Doppler shift and how we can use it in order to gain information about stars. So we need to first talk about light again. So far we've been treating light like a wave. And that's true, light does behave like a wave, but not always. So in the early 1900s, through the study of quantum mechanics, we actually found out that sometimes light behaves like a particle called a photon. So basically the idea behind photons is you can either treat light like it's behaving as a wave, in which case you have a frequency and an amplitude and all that jazz, or you can treat it like a stream of particles. So here, atoms and the electrons in the atom specifically are going to interact with the light, and they're going to absorb and emit fixed amounts of light. And the frequency now is not a wave frequency, but it corresponds to the change in energy in your electron. Remember, high frequency is high energy, low frequency is low energy. And these electrons we're going to find have very specific energies that they require. The amplitude is no longer the amplitude of a wave. So the luminosity wouldn't be set by like how fast or how high these things are waving. Your luminosity is now a measure of how many of these interactions are happening. So instead of an amplitude based on, how intense the wave itself is, now we have a stream of particles, and the amplitude is going to be a measure of how many particles are in your stream. Before we talk about that, we need to talk about the atom. So a lot of people falsely believe that the electron is like a hard little ball that is an orbit around the nucleus. So they have this idea where like an atom is a nucleus, and the nucleus is like the sun, and the electron is a small object that orbits the nucleus, so the electron is like the Earth. And they have like the solar system model of an atom in their head. And that's actually not how atoms behave. So electrons around an atom form what are called orbital shells. And these are basically the electron no longer acting like a particle, but acting like a wave. Electrons do this too. And so this orbital shell is a probability of where you will find the electron. So for example, in the lowest orbital shell, the s orbital, S for sphere, the electron occupies a region called the, or a region of space that looks like a sphere. So there is a probability that you will find the electron somewhere in this sphere. For the p orbitals, the next ones up, they have this peanut shape. And so the electron can either be found here or here, but nowhere else. You won't find it anywhere else. Only in this region of space here and this region of space here. The p orbital has a few different orientations. So you'll find electrons in these portions and these portions as well. So if you've taken a chemistry class, or you maybe took a chemistry class in high school, you can fit 2 electrons per orbital. So 1s1, 1s2, those are the 2 electrons that fit in the s orbital, the smallest s orbital. Then you have 2s1 and 2s2, and then you'll have your p orbital shells. So there are 6 of them because there are 3 orientations, and you can put 2 electrons in each of them. There are 5 different orientations for the d orbital shell. And you can fit 2 electrons in each of these as well. So there are 10 electrons that you can fit in the d orbital shell, and then f, and they get more and more complicated from here on out. I'm not going to explain where this comes from. You do not need to know. But you do need to know that electrons form orbital shells, and they're not like a solar system model. That's not what atoms look like. And we've known atoms don't look like that for a very long time. I do not know why that is the persistent model that people walk away with in pop culture, because that hasn't been true for literally almost 100 years. All right, as the electron energy level increases or decreases, the electron is basically bumped to a different orbital shell. So if you are in shell 1s, so you're in the s orbital, and you are in the lowest s orbital, the 1, it is possible for your electron to increase in energy and move up to the 2s orbital, which is bigger. Or if you've received enough energy, maybe you're moving into the p orbitals. Or if you're receiving even more energy, it's possible that the electron receives so much energy that it actually eventually breaks contact with the initial atom and is just sent flying off into space. So our atoms have weird orbitals, and each of these orbitals have a specific energy associated with them. Based on if the electron loses or gains energy, it can shift into another orbital. Now, each orbital has a specific amount of energy associated with it, and only that energy. It cannot be higher or lower. It is very specific. The energy of an orbital is referred to as an energy level, and switching from one orbital to the other requires either increasing or decreasing the amount of energy of your electron so that it matches the orbital level. And that is facilitated by photons. So either an electron will absorb a lot of energy via photons and absorb just the right amount so that it jumps up to the right energy level, or in order to drop from a high energy level to a low one, it'll emit a photon. So exchanging photons like this, either absorbing them or emitting them, is how electrons change energy levels. And this happens spontaneously. So if an electron finds itself in a very high orbital level, it will spontaneously drop to a lower one. And in doing so, it'll emit a photon of the corresponding frequency. If an electron is hit by a photon with a specific frequency, it will spontaneously jump into a higher energy level. The collection of allowed light emission for these transitions between energy levels is known as an atomic emission spectrum, or spectral lines. Every atom has a slightly different structure, and because the energy levels that are associated with specific atoms and specific states are different, this means we can actually use the emission line spectrum as a fingerprint to let us know which elements are present. So for example, this is our hydrogen emission spectrum, our hydrogen emission spectrum. Hydrogen is easy because it famously only has 4 transitions that are visible to the human eye. We actually have the extended spectrum here. The human eye can usually see between 400 and 700 nanometers. So for most people, there's a bright 650 nanometer line. That's a red line. Then there is a slightly dimmer line in like the 475 region. And then there are 2 lines between 400 and 450 that are fairly easy to see. So what is going on here? Well, if you take a look on the left-hand side, we actually have an energy level diagram. So in dropping from energy level 3 to 2, that is where the emission of that red line takes place. In dropping between 4 to 2, that is where the dark blue line comes from. In dropping from 5 to 2 and 6 to 2, those are where the 2 violet lines come from. So they are specific transitions. Anytime an electron drops from energy level 3 to energy level 2, it will emit this red line. And it is a very specific line, and it has a very specific frequency associated with it, a very specific wavelength associated with it. If this specific wavelength were to hit an electron in energy level 2, it would jump up to energy level 3, and then later on it would fall back down to energy level 2 and emit this light. We have some emission lines from other common elements. So the sodium emission line is fairly easy to spot because of the sodium doublet. So these two yellow lines are very close to each other, and you can actually see it fairly easily on the sodium spectrum. So it's one of those things that's very easy to spot. Obviously, hydrogen and helium are the two most common elements in the solar system. So those two are fairly good for looking at. Because neon doesn't react with anything else, it's pretty common to use that in classrooms. So if we were in the classroom, I'd actually show you the neon spectrum. Mercury is an interesting one because fluorescent lights use mercury. So astronomers actually generally block these specific lines so that street lamps don't mess with observations. So when I use my personal telescope and I try to take astrophotos, I actually have a city light suppression filter that I put on my camera that eliminates these specific lines and the sodium line. So just really cool, interesting stuff. We can actually talk about these in the same way, but backwards. So we know that specific energy transitions emit these lines, but we also know that specific energy transitions absorb these lines. So going from energy level 3 to energy level 2 in the hydrogen atom will cause that red line to be emitted. But going the other way, if you have a hydrogen atom that absorbs that red line, it'll jump from energy level 2 to energy level 3. So we actually can take a look at which lines are missing, and that'll give us an idea of the makeup of certain objects. So for example, this is a black body spectrum for the sun. And we have in the red here, the amount of light that actually makes it to the Earth. And you can see that we can tell the composition of the atmosphere based on how much of the sunlight actually makes it down to Earth. And you can see there's a bit of emission that is missing. And there are huge notches where the emission is just not visible at all. So famously in the infrared, there are several different places where water is hard to like water blocks the transmission line. So you get absorption lines. If you look at the spectrum here and you look at like where these water bits show up. So let me go ahead and point these out. So like here, or this one is like the famous gap, or this one here. There's no light that makes it through. So that is light that is being absorbed by the water in the atmosphere. We also have ozone at work over here. And there's a few bands that are associated with carbon dioxide and with oxygen. You'll also notice there are like little tiny little absorption lines here. Those are absorption lines that are slightly weaker for reasons that are just either from abundance, so there's not very much of that thing. Water is very common. Water vapor is very common in our atmosphere, as is carbon dioxide and oxygen. So these smaller absorption lines are likely just things that aren't very present in our atmosphere. We can also get an idea of what's going on with the makeup of an object by taking a look at spectra. So sometimes spectra are really the only means we have of studying a star. So we can analyze a star's outer layer by taking a look at the spectrum. Here we are with the solar spectrum again, and now we have an explanation for what these dark spots are. So our sun emits light in all colors. Our sun is a black body, and thermal radiation like that is continuous. But the upper atmosphere of the sun contains a lot of elements in it, and those elements absorb some of the light on the way out. So the solar spectrum is never going to look like a complete rainbow. You're never going to get every single light band here. And instead what we see is we actually see absorption in our sun. And what this is this is taking the solar spectrum and it's spreading it out so that we're really stretching it and we can get a pretty in-depth look at the types of things that are being absorbed here. So there's some pretty strong emission and absorption lines going on. So for example, over here, we have a very strong absorption line in the red. If I had to guess, I would say this is probably that red line from hydrogen, but I have no way of knowing that for certain. We also have two very strong yellow absorption lines. So that is probably the sodium line. But again, I don't have a way of knowing that for sure. I don't have the scaling for this, so I couldn't tell you exactly what this is. But the general idea is that if we know what frequencies these correspond to, we can figure out what the sun is made out of. So in a second, we're going to talk about the Doppler effect. And the Doppler effect can actually give us an idea of how far away something is and how fast it's moving based on these sort of lines. So either emission lines or absorption lines, if you know where they're supposed to go, and then you take a measurement of where they actually are, you can figure out a lot about a star. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the Doppler effect. So what is the Doppler effect? When you move towards or away from a wave source, it changes the frequency. So I don't know if you've ever been somewhere where you've heard an ambulance approaching, but you've probably heard this. So an ambulance is approaching, and then it moves past you. So what happened? The sound changes. Well, the sound changes because of the Doppler effect. As an object approaches you, the frequency of the source increases. Now for sound, the frequency has to do with pitch. So something that is high pitched, something up here, is very high frequency, and something that is low pitch, something down here, is very low frequency. Now, when an object moves towards you, the frequency increases, and when the object moves away from you, the frequency decreases. This is what we call the Doppler effect. Now, for stars, we are looking at light, not sound, and the way that light appears is in color. So our star here is emitting in green. If that star is approaching us, the frequency shifts up, so we see blue. But if the star is moving away from us, the frequency shifts down and we see red. That's the general idea. So how does this work? Well, if you know where these absorption lines are supposed to be, you can actually tell if an object is coming towards you or moving away from you. So for example, in this example, we have an unshifted line. Take a look at maybe these two lines here, which I think are supposed to represent part of the hydrogen spectrum. So we have the red, we have the blue, and then we have that those two lines in like the violet region. So we have the unshifted spectrum. If an object is moving away from us, all of the lines get shifted to the right, towards the red. And if an object is moving towards us, all of the lines get shifted higher, toward the blue. Now, the radial velocity is a measure of how fast something is moving towards or away from us. And the faster the object moves, the more the shift happens. So a faster moving object shifts by more. If an object is moving away from us very, very fast, everything is going to shift towards the red by a lot. If the object is moving away from us pretty slowly, there's going to be a shift, but it's going to be a lot less noticeable. So the other thing that the Doppler effect does is we can actually account for the expansion of the universe using the Doppler shift. So nearby objects in our galaxy all appear to be moving towards us. And the reason they're all blue shifted, so Andromeda, for example, is blue shifted, Triangulum is blue shifted, the galactic center is blue shifted. And the reason all of these things appear blue shifted is because gravity is pulling us together, right? But more distant objects all seem to be moving away from us. That's weird. Why would they be moving away from us? And the answer is that the universe is expanding. So because the universe is expanding, all of these objects are moving away from us. And because the expansion is uniform, every region of space is expanding at the same rate, we think. Because the expansion is uniform, things that are farther out appear to be moving away from us faster. Because there's more distance between us, and all of that distance has to expand. So we can actually take a look at these objects, and just based on their redshift, we can tell how far away they are. If the redshift is explained primarily through Hubble expansion, so the expansion of the universe, that means that if something is farther away from us, it should have a higher redshift. And that is actually a way that you can measure how far something is. So there is a parameter called the redshift. And something that is high redshift is something that is very, very far away. And something that is low redshift is something that's very close. I'm not going to get into the math here. This is actually our very last slide. I used to have the math on this slide, and people didn't like it. They thought it was confusing. So I'm not going to put it in here. But if you're interested in high redshift versus low redshift, I can show you the math. It's actually not hard. Things that are redshift 1 are already billions of light years away. So this is like, we're talking huge distances here. High redshift is very far away. All right, that's it for this lecture. By the time you see this, the quiz will be up online, so remember to go take that. This week, we also have exam 1 that is due on Friday. I'm going to grade that over the weekend, so please try to get that in on time. And yeah, that's it for this week. Next week, we'll pick up with whatchamacallit, with solar system formation. I'm going to put one extra lecture up this week just as a bonus. You don't need to watch it, but it's on telescope design. So if you wanted to see how sort of our understanding of light translates to telescope, I have an old lecture from an Astro 12 class. I'm going to go ahead and upload that so you can see it if you'd like. Completely optional. There's not going to be a test on it. There's no quiz on it. So don't worry about it if you don't want to watch it. But I don't know, it's great extra information. All right, that's it this week. I will see you all next week during the last live session. Take care and have a good weekend.